Good evening. This is the Policy Committee meeting for Tuesday, March 23rd, 2017. It's just about 7 p.m. and we're going to be getting underway. We have a number of policies this evening, and we'll handle them as we come to them. We'll go around the table, we'll do the introductions so everybody's voice is on, and I'll begin. I'm Jerry Grupp. I'm School Board Director and the Chair of the Policy Committee.
Wendy Thomas, School Board.
Andy Block, School Board.
Chuck Lambert, Director of Special Services for the school districts.
Lori Krusich, Parent and Diversity and Inclusion Council Member.
Mark Weinstein, Parent, Diversity and Inclusion Council Member and lead of the Policies and Procedures Committee of the Council.
And Will Holmes, also a parent and member of the Diversity and Inclusion Citizens Council, and currently serving as chairman of that group.
Robert Frazier, Superintendent.
Christine Taylor, Director of Human Resources.
Gary Pazian.
Matt Feddersen, Director IT.
And Kyle, as we're beginning attendance, Kyle McKessie called to register that she'll be attending in a few moments. Out of deference for our three guests this evening, I will say we have a full agenda. We tend to time box these meetings and try and get out of here by 9. If there is a specific agenda item here this evening, if you'd let us know what that is, if there was one that you were here endeared to, then we could move that forward so that, and I know you have a commentary you wanted to provide us as well on another policy, which I believe is not listed this evening. So if you wanted to, we'll work a little out of order unless your pleasure is to stay for 2 hours and sit through all of the Hazarai that we do. Is there a specific agenda item this evening that you want to speak, or I could actually let you make the commentary that you wanted to make regarding the other policies?
So both. So I think actually the last three policies we had the most attention and focus on, and then we also wanted to submit a couple policies for review.
If it's the will of the assembled, I'm fine with moving that forward. I think it achieves the goal of the committee. And Chuck, with all due deference, I'm sure we'll get to your review.
No problem.
All right, so I apologize.
Appreciate that.
So let's begin with the policies, the 103 and 104 series. These will be the non-discrimination in school and classroom practices, followed by the or incorporated as well, the non-discrimination on the basis of disability. And then the other policy in that group would be the affirmative action program for employment and contract practices. And
They're going to be in the back of the packet.
they're going to be further down. Thank you, Smith. And Christine, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through those portions initially. Thank you. You put them in the order registered. And I'll turn it over to you at this point.
So Jerry, since this is my first meeting, would you be so kind as to just give me a very brief tutorial on how you normally do this? Do you walk through each section, or do you just look at changes?
Great, well, good question. What we typically do is, since Matt has provided us with both the existing policy and the proposed changes, and Matt, thank you for taking the time to put them together like that. That makes our life so much easier.
It's the new and then the old, so if you separated your packet, you probably missed the
I haven't said that. No, it's here. It's just, I separated one too soon on the 103. The 103 on the, that's what I did. Okay, thank you. So Christine, what we tend to do is, we don't talk about the old one, we look at what is new and changed in the new one. If there's anything that you, as you read it, it came to you that you thought was potentially problematic or that you would have changed, your preference would be to change. And then the board members normally comment on what their thoughts or requests.
I mean, I can speak to it in a general sense, and then we can go into specificity. The first thing that I did was look at our neighboring school districts in this policy to make sure that our policy looks similar to that of Central Bucks, Quakertown. This policy has a few things that are unique to us in terms of how to report and who to report to. And I also, as I looked through, wanted to make sure that we included language that refers back to applicable school code, state laws, federal laws, and also felt that the way that it was written, it only needed some minor refinements, but it's a policy that makes I think the complaint process very clear and also the steps in that process. So as you look through, the language changes are minimal and are pretty self-explanatory. You'll notice on the second page, the highlighted changes on the first and second page are just words and phrasing, making sure that the procedures for reporting the complaint are to the appropriate people here in Council Rock. And then if you flip to the page step 2, investigation was probably where I made the most suggested changes from what was already there.
103.
Yeah, but it's 103, there is a new page for it, 4.
I put the new ones before the.
Yeah.
The new ones before the.
Under step 2, investigation, there's a greater number of changes. Again, making sure that our policy is a clear demonstration of who to report the complaint to. Once the investigation begins, making sure that the building principal immediately notifies the appropriate compliance officer. The next set of changes make sure that our steps in terms of investigations are clear with what that entails. And also including, again, the language about should a criminal offense have occurred, that we inform the authorities if we believe that that would be the case. And going down to the bottom of the page, the district action, you will notice that I added and made some changes there that talks about the student code of conduct, board policies, administrative regs, and then also cites language that appears in our neighboring districts and is important about federal law and the prohibitions against discrimination found there.
So there's a little bit of restructuring in terms of the reporting, because the second section under the old one was notification of rights, and that's now incorporated elsewhere. In the old procedure, it was reporting was number 1 again, but then we went to a notification of rights, and that's now.
So you have delegation of responsibility, the complaint procedure. And I think where you would find that section, Jerry, is on the second page. The building principal or designee shall be responsible to complete the following duties. So instead of having the heading notification of rights, steps 1 through 5 on page 2 have similar steps. You inform the student that they have a right to file a complaint. They may be accompanied by a parent or guardian.
I got you.
I don't feel like it's missing anything from the old policy, but what I think it is a lot more clear and concise in terms of what's going to happen and how we're going to investigate. You'll notice too that there's a slight change under the investigative procedures that states that during the appeal procedure, the compliance officer may also conduct a reasonable investigation. So during the appeal process, the compliance officer is able to then reinvestigate or investigate additional facts or clarifications. I did not make the changes to the equivalence between schools, so I can't speak to those.
And I guess one of the questions I had in this, and I'm not sure where if I see it, is that, and I don't know if it was in the previous one either, was if a discriminatory act rises, if the complaint has an aspect to it that would potentially rise to a criminal complaint. Yeah, I'm looking for it. That's what I thought I had seen it. Right.
In the investigation on, if you go 1 to page 3, step 2, if the investigation results in a determination that the conduct being investigated may involve a violation of criminal law, the building principal shall inform law enforcement authorities. The obligation to conduct the investigation shall not be negated by the fact that a criminal investigation is pending.
Yeah, for me, the question really related to timing. And that's, sorry. Oh, okay. The question for me really related to timing, and also the other aspect about this that I am interested in, particularly with regard to children, is for investigating aspects of certain behavior involving children, there's a thought around you only want the investigation, you only want the child interviewed once. Now, some of this may actually go to more criminal matters regarding sexual abuse or sexual misconduct involving a child. But there's that whole concept of interview the child once and they don't tell the story many times. So I'm just looking here to try and figure out when we get to that trigger, that when we find that trigger may involve, so we execute against it more quickly. And I'd rather have the police department involved if we think there may be some aspect of criminality sooner, so we coordinate with them. There's different degrees of different standards here in terms of, I'm just not sure how to resolve it.
You could make the adjustment that if the investigation involves a determination that the conduct being investigated may be a violation of criminal law, the building principal shall inform the compliance officer, the superintendent, because this is just a thought, by elevating it to that, then you know that it will be made immediately. You could put in.
And I want to change the term, I would think, I'm looking to my fellow board members to remember this, the thought that it's a determination, I think that seems to be a conclusion. That seems to be a conclusion, which would seem to be at the end of the investigation. And I'm trying to look for a word or phrase that would bring it forward that there would be a suspicion. Remember, in dealing with children, even and protecting children for abuse cases, we work on this notion of if there's a suspicion, we're mandatory reporters. It's not that there's a determination that there's been abuse and then we're mandatory reporters. And I'm trying to echo that same concept. Does this make sense to everybody what I'm going for? That I'm trying to echo that same concept.
Well, for one thing, it says
When do you
if-
pull the trigger?
That's
what the
that's-
investigation results in is basically saying you have to investigate it first.
Right, that's what I'm trying to figure
It
out.
should say at any time,
How
at
about
the
if
point
during
of
the
complaint,
investigation?
before, if somebody comes and complains and right away, you think you would, I mean, it seems
Sure.
obvious,
If the
right?
allegation
Or-
is.
Right,
And that
so
in
you
practice,
almost
that is
just
how
have
it
to say
works.
from a point of complaint forward, at the point at which there's suspected criminal activity, it will be immediately reported to the authorities. It's not the where it's treated here, it sounds like you're gonna figure it out, and then,
I think you moved
So-
paragraph 3 language up to paragraph 1, and it gets
reporting,
rephrased.
yes.
That upon receiving a complaint of discrimination, the building principal will notify the compliance officer. And then we can craft some language here that says the compliance officer will notify the law enforcement authorities should they believe there may be a violation.
If
Something
there's a-
suspected,
correct.
it could be
Yeah.
suspected.
Suspected, or
Yeah.
if there's a suspicion of,
I would just leave it
and
broad
say,
that
and
it's
it's
not just
a
that reporting.
reasonable, and it's a
But if at
reasonable.
any point during either reporting or investigation that comes up, we would immediately report it.
Yeah.
I think it's like just trying to get both sections at any time. You would think that would happen, but if we're writing down the steps.
Exactly, that, because I don't want to have a situation where we point to it backwards after the fact.
Yeah.
So do we want Christine to wordsmith that and then bring it to the next meeting?
I think so, I think that's
Okay.
within the space that makes sense. That's just my quick find.
So I made
Just so we-
it in twice.
I don't think she has to wait till the next meeting. I mean, if she can do it and then recirculate to the board, then we can provide individual feedback.
Well, that was one comment. I'm open to anybody else's concerns or looks, as we talk.
I did think it was much clearer policy.
It's much easier to read.
Yeah,
Easy.
I always found the old policies kind of said what they said, but they used a lot of words to say. So how about the next week, public comment?
Well, let's finish
Oh,
walking through this ourselves.
wonderful.
I'm not against public comments, but we don't only do public comment on each one. So the equivalence, I'm trying to get to what the equivalence in the schools was, because that's kind of a new notion for us, is it not? And Chuck, I guess that well, this is yours, that kind of speaks to Title I and program. And you just went, John, I'm speaking to Chuck now, which is, you just went through this the other day, you helped us to understand what Title I means. It means we, in our school, in our discussion the other day, you talked about Title I schools as well. Do we have schools that are Title I versus schools that are not Title I?
We do, at the elementary level.
And
They're just not, so you think of that as being solely Title I. There are schools that house Title I programs.
correct.
And
Yes,
schools that don't.
that's right.
And basically the point of this, as I read it, since it's under discrimination, it's like you can't, not that anybody would ever do this, but put all the kids who need Title I in one school and then not give them the same thing all the other kids do.
Right.
Which isn't even how we run our schools, but that's why this is written.
Right.
Is that what I'm
Yes.
understanding?
That's the spirit of it.
And so we're
Because
including,
only because it's in discrimination.
right, and we're including that language here because we're required to. That's the other, Christine, that's the other big thing that comes many times in this, which is, are we including language because we must or because we just are duplicating law? So we sometimes choose not to duplicate law in our own policies because the law is the law.
I assumed it was recommended.
And it's also present in, when I did a review of other policies of our neighboring districts, it's included there as well. I don't think it's a bad idea to have it. You may not need it, Jerry, it could be implicit.
No
I
problem.
don't think it hurts anything. With other people.
There is,
Besides, which you never know if you get to a time where somebody redistricts and does something different.
no, you're right. I think the other thing that's a buy in this one that I don't see in the old one was that we now have specific time limits. Well, we did before too.
We did.
Okay. Anybody else have? Just so the public is aware, we have been joined now by Ed Tate, board member, and also by Kyle McKessie, board member. Anybody else have any comments or? Before, we will because of their single purpose for joining us tonight. Any other board members have comments or criticisms?
So
Go ahead, Matt.
Christine's gonna make the minor tweaks and then I'll email to the board for the review. If that comments get back to you.
Correct.
If
Well,
there's no major comments, we'll just,
right, so we'll,
okay.
this will be on our agenda. We'll take public comment, but this will be on the agenda for the
April 20th board meeting.
April 20th, so we will see each other many times between now and then too. Right, so we'll distribute it to the board. Christine, when you distribute it to the board, if you highlight the section we're working on, you can just put a different color because it's different than what we saw tonight. And if anybody has any further objections or commentary. Kyle and Ed, what we have done is we actually wanted to move up some phrasing in this about when it would be escalated to a potential criminal act would have been escalated to the police department. And we've moved it forward with a little more, to make it a little more rapid than this initially had indicated.
Do they know which policies we're doing?
Okay, 103, I'm sorry.
The one at the end.
Will the board want to invite our guests to comment on individual policies, so should we move them up?
Seems like it would make sense.
Public comment? On the policies we're talking about, on
Talking about
103.
103?
Yeah.
Okay. That's, and forgive my verbal nodding in agreement earlier.
I didn't know I was right or wrong, that's good.
Just a few comments. In identifying the protected populations in the first paragraph under authority, I see sex and I see sexual orientation. And I know we're going to get to this later, it's not an agenda item, but I would still suggest that gender expression is a separate category of a protected population. And I would urge the committee to include sex, sexual orientation, and gender expression as all protected areas, protected populations that are covered by this policy. Should I keep going? Or is it?
No,
do
yeah,
you want-
keep going.
Okay.
It's not, I'm not a judge, so we don't pass individual judgment on it. But
Well,
we'll incorporate it
I
in
didn't
discussion.
know if anyone wanted to.
I don't see a massive objection to that. Does anybody see a massive?
I'd like to be
objection?
enlightened.
In what sense?
with regard to how you're using the term. And I mean, I'd like to understand it. I don't mean that I disagree with it in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. So, we're going to, I hope in accordance with the board's generous offer to hear from us on this point later, be, requesting that this committee consider a transgender policy. And one of the things that the transgender policy includes is definitions. And candidly, they're definitions that I didn't know a month ago. Okay, so I'm learning about this, now as well. Turning to the Lower Merion School District regulations relating to transgender policies, gender expression is defined as the manner in which a person's gender identity is communicated to others through appearance, behavior, or physical characteristics that may be in accord with or opposed to one's physical anatomy, chromosomal sex, or sex at birth. We shall include, but is not limited to, persons who are undergoing or have completed sex change. So, in other words, sex in the way that it's used here, I think is intended to mean the chromosomal sex identity assigned to a child at birth. Okay, so that's sex. Sexual orientation, I think we all know, is a person's preference for sexual activity, and those two categories are distinct from gender expression. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand the intent. I had just attended a seminar as well a few weeks ago on the topic, and I don't remember the term sexual expression being used. At the same time, I also,
Gender expression.
Gender expression, sorry.
Right.
You're right, sorry. Reading one, saying another. I don't remember that. I remember that term at the time was gender identity. Now, the world is fluid, and things change quickly. And the other thing was, I also heard you were talking about sex change, and that term, when used, is also considered by some to be pejorative. So I want to be very careful of the words, because some people choose the term. It has been expressed to me that it's gender reassignment rather than change. So I want to be very careful as we walk down some of these paths, because the words are, the topic is fluid at this point, and I want to be careful as we write policy we don't get stuck in this jello that we create.
I understand that, and when you have an opportunity to read through this Lower Merion policy, there are words in here that candidly I thought, without being educated, were offensive. Words like queer, genderqueer. They're cisgender. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm not suggesting that this committee should be sensitive to that. But there's a lot of language that we may be unfamiliar with that I think all of us in the community and the school board, definitely should consider. So whether it's gender identity or gender expression,
Yeah, exactly.
I think that the important thing is that concept is distinct from both sex and sexual orientation. So that whether you use the term gender identity or gender expression, we would ask that that category be separately identified in the discrimination policy.
I think it's worth noting, some of what we do in policy is making sure that we don't box ourselves into a place that we don't want to be and eliminate some of what might be covered there. So I think you have there is a very receptive group here. It's just a matter of figuring out that we're using terminology that doesn't put us in a place where we're eliminating others.
Sure.
That's what I heard from Jerry. Certainly believe I know from working with Jerry all these years. It's not about not including that. It's making sure that we don't put ourselves in a position where we are eliminating something else. We're boxing ourselves into a corner.
And we want it to be as inclusive and protective as possible.
Yeah, and it's actually an interesting notion, which is one thing which I've advocated for, but time is time, a universal glossary for our terms.
Right.
Because then, if I were in that space, then what I would simply categorize it as a protected class, list my protected class, because I use the same protected classes universally in so many places, and I should. That would make my life easier for maintaining my list of practices,
Right.
policies. I think we'll take it as something we want to do. We just have to figure out how it works in light of the second recommendation. So Matt, when we say that we're going to bring it up on April 3rd, 21st, let's hold on that for a second, because we're going to look at that. We're going to hear what they say later, and we may bring things together as a cohesive group at a subsequent. So we're not delaying, but so that they all come up coordinated.
Sure.
So other comments on this 103?
Yeah, there are a few. In terms of step 2, investigation, there's a very, on page 3, very high level outline. I mean, it's like a 30,000 foot view of what an investigation might look like. That it includes interviews, may include interviews with the complainant, accused, and others with knowledge relative to the incident. The investigator may evaluate any other information or materials relevant to the investigation. And I don't know where this would go, in which step. However, we would request that the committee consider adding a requirement that investigators receive training to conduct these investigations, because nowhere in here are there any requirements in terms of training for investigators who conduct these very sensitive investigations. And I understand it's often the school principal, and school principals conduct all kinds of investigations, but figuring out who punched whom is a different kind of investigation from a discrimination complaint investigation. And I know there are lots of training programs available for doing this kind of work, and so we think that would be an important requirement of the policy.
And just an additional note on the training, I believe in the older policy, there was actually a section that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we saw it in the new policy, that the compliance officers would take training, I believe, on an annual basis.
Yeah, it is there, it's on page 2, so it's definitely abbreviated language and not as,
Right, very
not as
abbreviated from
detailed.
the old policy.
So you do have some inclusion there of some training language on page 2.
Yeah,
It's
so,
not as lengthy.
right, so, and I think it loses a lot of meat to the intent. So this one just says provision of training for students and staff to identify and alleviate problems of discrimination, whereas the older policy clearly stated that the compliance officers would receive annual training on what constitutes discrimination, includes harassment, sexual violence, and the procedure to investigate a complaint of discrimination. The compliance officers are responsible to monitor the implementation of non-discrimination procedures in the following areas, and it goes into a lot of detail. So I think taking that section out and just leaving it as the one-liner for the training that's on page 2 now, it creates a large gap in the effectiveness of the compliance officers, and like Mark mentioned, it should extend to anybody that would be in charge of the investigation as well. And in addition, we also don't think that training, and correct us if we're wrong, but if that training has been happening, there should be also some type of accountability to make sure that the training does occur on an annual basis.
I'm fine with training the compliance officer and putting a little more detail around that. I'm not as fine with requiring the compliance officers involved in the investigation. It's their job to be trained. With all the other training that the people in those sections, there's just only so much we can legislate. So if the compliance officer is involved and they've been trained for me, I would be okay with that.
And we do train our staff on general harassment and sexual
Well, so you could
harassment.
say that, yes, if we're doing general, and the principals have to get their principal's license and they have to do a number of things, but I think if I want to move to that, then I'm just going to say the compliance officer is going to be involved in the investigation and they're going to be trained.
kind of agreeable on page 3 of 8 of the old one of lifting the compliance officer shall receive section and dropping it in, to the point about training in the new policy at 2. That is really, the training is really more of a proactive, that's not for the investigative staff, that's really more proactive training of, in general, how to alleviate those problems. You know, we spoke in the hall, you know, one of my pet areas is disabilities, you know, and that would include the things that we would normally do in collaboration with the school about how do you address a person in a wheelchair? You know, how do you speak to the person, not to the attendant, those sort of things. That's what that training was really geared towards, that you referenced. As a pragmatic matter, I think that Christine would be the compliance officer. She also, I believe, if it's here, it will be another one. You're also the Title IX officer for the district, are you not, Christine? Christine?
I am.
She's one of 3, actually.
For
certain.
student, for staff and student.
Okay. And just as a pragmatic matter, how things often work, when we often will engage external persons to perform the investigations when there is any thought that there might be some aspect of protecting, you know, in police parlance, it's the thin blue line, you know, where one police officer is said to thought to protect another. If we have any thought that that might occur within our own environment, we often engage. Those are often, we often will reach out to other attorneys, other counselors, not of Eastburn and Gray typically, because that's our board counsel,
Right.
to bring in somebody who has experience in the realm.
So is there any reason you would just codify that and say, you know, that the board retains discretion to conduct an independent investigation?
It's not the board, it's actually, we have the administration.
So-
It's the administration. Do we not capture that where we talk about the assignment? Unless the building principal is subject for the complaint and is unable to conduct the investigation. To that point, incorporating at the top of page 3, and I don't mean to speak for the board, guys, so if I say something anybody disagrees, please. I could see where we would open that up a little bit more at the top of page 3 to not have it only when the building principal is the subject of the investigation, that if there is a thought of possible, give me a good word, some wordsmith here, conflict or prejudice on behalf of the person who
compliance
might.
officer decides if it can be adequately handled or, you know, or outside you know, more specialized.
So I'm
You can.
good for going in that direction.
I'm
Okay.
To the
fine with
question.
that too.
Which,
Yeah, I think there was, in the old policy, there was also language,
give me,
on,
where,
on page 3, section 2D, where basically, to summarize, it says that the superintendent may also refer specific cases to an outside consultant.
oh, okay. And we have,
Yes, yeah.
sorry.
Yes.
And so just relating to that point, since it seems like you're in agreement that that should be included, I guess, or at least considered. Another gap that we believe we see, and again, anything correct us if we're wrong. Speaking of superintendent, that there's a communication gap. So it seems that, you know, most cases would stop and end at the compliance officers unless they saw the need to escalate to the superintendent. But we actually feel that the superintendent should at least be made aware of any and all cases, whether or not the superintendent decides to take action, but awareness should be there, because I think you heard from the town hall forums that we had that there were a lot of incidents that never really made it past, whether it was teacher level, principal level, compliance officer level, but a lot of things weren't aware to the highest of levels. So having some type of accountability in here to make sure things are passed all the way up for at least FYI, it would be good to have.
That's currently our practice, so for Barry, for Sue, and for myself, that would be reflective of our practice, what you're saying. That's what we do.
But it's gotta get to
Yeah, so I can craft something because that
That's
does
fine.
reflect our practice.
Absolutely.
And whether it's, and is our practice, it will reference the superintendent and or designee, because in certain situations, we have an assistant superintendent now, and Robert may choose to delegate certain aspects of it, which really means he has two cabinet level persons, just administratively, so you understand the structure. It's very fascinating. There are only 4 people in the district in the administration who are not part of any bargaining unit, actually have a direct contract with the district. Those 2 are the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, the business administrator, and Christine. So they actually have long-term contracts. So I tell you that from this perspective, which is the board can't take individual action against them outside of the contract. They have a contract of duration. So that gives them a level of confidence and communication with us that we can't take immediate retribution for something that might happen. That if they, I don't know what I'm saying, but I hope you understand what I mean.
No, yeah, basically
They're executive
they're in
level.
a safe space,
Right,
right?
they're the executive level of the company. Yeah.
And quick question, so just on the point of what is already the practice, is it also the practice at the building level? So if something is reported in a classroom, what's the policy and practice? How far does it go up? Because
Well, and that's where the conversations on our diversity intro or open house kind of revealed some gaps there.
right,
And that's where this is meant to clear that up by assigning a central administrator to really carry that ball.
okay,
That's the intent. So obviously incumbent within that, and let me say it without looking at it, which is the report at a lower level to a lower level person, to a teacher, to a principal, to a janitor, to anybody, ultimately has to come up here. If that's a miss, and that should be in here, right? That it comes to the compliance officer.
It
Well,
does say that.
Okay, so that's,
you know,
This says that too, so we have, since this has been adjusted,
Right.
and that was rather recent, I know Barry and I and Sue are seeing
yes.
More
adherence to this.
So we had updated this in office.
One thing you might consider to really facilitate reporting and ensure that reporting is, it doesn't address something that gets reported to an individual at the school level who isn't escalating it in accordance with policy. I mean, that's training, right, for everybody. But,
Well, they have training on that, right? But that's just not compliance,
right.
my opinion. They don't not know they're supposed to report up. They may forget because they're trained on a myriad of policies. We're human, but I don't believe it's just they haven't had enough training. We
Agreed.
certainly do a fair amount of training. That's why I'm not offended by the need for training, but to say yet again, somewhere we're gonna train an investigator, frankly, we do a lot of training on a lot of policies at the point at which an email or a district, one of the myriad of policies is offended, and do they remember it was significant or whatever that all the steps are supposed to take? I think it's more reinforcement than an initial training, because we do a lot of training on policy. I've been exposed to them.
Absolutely.
So that's why I was trying to say, I want to hold the compliance officer responsible, because that person has a solitary job and is much less than the everyday employee out there. But we may need, go ahead, because you were gonna say we need to have
Christine's trying to get a word in
report.
before.
We have the Act 126 training, which rolled out at the start of this school year, and that is a 3-hour training. It's mandated by legislation, but it covers many topics, including student-to-student bullying, electronic bullying. Then there's 2 harassment pieces that are more adult-to-adult. So I think this year, next year in particular, very fresh in people's minds. But as we get further away from the compliance period, I think that's when it becomes critical to have those reminder conversations, mention it at staff meetings. I think we're at a sweet spot right now where there's a lot of training and awareness around what to look for.
My personal preference right now would be to spend more of our training effort in teaching people the right behaviors to avoid the recurrence.
Sure, that
would be number one. And I'm going to look to the compliance officer that if I get a slew of these things that become an investigative problem, then we'll support her with additional investigative resources who are appropriately trained. I don't want to, I think spending more of that energy and training to avoid having the issue come up is more fruitful than spending a lot of time educating how to do the investigation. That's just my take on it.
Well, and this wasn't the point that I was trying to make, but just to finish this conversation, another resource that could be helpful if you don't want to put the time and commit principals to additional training is a handbook, so that the principal can basically go through a checklist of what makes an investigation complete. And, that's something that even, not to make more work for anyone, at the executive level, but that's something that you could produce.
I have to tell you, I think that is probably something, and that's not a bad investment for us. I would assume that there are guidelines for that produced by either PSBA or some law firm.
I would think so.
That would
think
give
so.
that, and that would avoid us having to,
Right.
handcrafting stuff, as great as we are, handcrafting it is.
No need to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. So
So-
I will say this, that I would look for, I look to Robert and Christine for that, to say, it's not a bad idea to find a resource that would be along those lines and to provide that. And if we had a workshop that ran with a few people about that, that would be sufficient.
Well, doesn't that belong in the administrative regs, something like that?
They need to identify the resource and then provide the resource.
The other thought I had was if something is reportable to the superintendent, perhaps it should be also reportable to the board. A complaint or an investigation. I mean, we do that regularly.
So the only thing we've run into with that is we become, you're gonna have to explain these differences. We become judge when somebody has a gripe against the district. So in the past, in some very general terms, they tell us limited information because they tell us too much, then we are prejudiced against.
Oh, yeah.
You're the arbiter of.
Well, no.
We are the
It's a
trier.
wacky thing. When you first get on the board, you're like, what do you mean you can't tell me?
We are the trier of fact.
Yeah.
Okay, so when there's a dispute with a staff member, or there's an administrative dispute with a child or something, it's presented to us as hearing officers,
Right.
and we make a determination.
Yeah.
Now, having said that,
So we
I almost
limited.
added when it's resolved. I mean, that could be the solution, right?
In practice, so I'll give you this. In practice, we do get an advisory in executive session because it relates to a specific individual, and it's cursory. We often don't have names. We have general characteristics of what happened. If we take what the incidents that sparked, we were made aware of them, but we had to rely on a police investigation, and
But that's
couldn't go
not
much
policy, so I feel like and I don't know where it should land, but I think to Ed's point, I don't think Ed is saying the board should hear and receive the same information the superintendent is hearing, because that is probably not appropriate, but the mere fact of the board is informed
Yes, we are.
that we are as a matter of practice. I
Oh,
think
I see
that's
what
what
you're
you're
saying.
saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. And so in whatever limited fashion that information could be shared that is appropriate, then it's another layer of accountability.
Well, and what we heard in the forums was that there was a feeling that certain matters didn't ever get to the board in the past that should have.
Yeah,
That's
that was one of my last comments here, but I mean, accountability is, if you want to talk about that.
would it suffice to say, and I haven't worked it all out in my mind, I would want a summary on a twice a year, semi-annual, who knows, every 6 months. Just a summary of the incident, of incidents that have been reported and concluded, where they found, just at a high level.
Related to this policy.
Yeah, just what, at some level, forgive me, I'm not checking up on Christine, but I'm trying to figure out
Well, there's 3 complaints.
what is,
So we'd be checking up on 3 of them.
but just what has happened, so that when, in a year and a half, when we go to, someone says, this has been happening a lot, and we go, I don't know. We could look at it and say, well, it happened in this The first half of the year, we had 3, and two were found to be founded, 1 was found to be unfounded.
That's
And
not a policy, that's more of a, that's
it's,
more of an administrative
it's,
action.
well, just the obligation to ask that, the point would be here that on twice a year, that the superintendent summarize the activities of, under this, that the investigations conducted under this policy,
It's easy enough.
and to the board.
And, sorry, related question, how are incidents documented today? Or where is it in the policy, how they're documented? Whether by practice or policy.
See, this is, I tell you this story, which is my son was in 8th grade, had another student with autism, turned to him, remember my son's quad, and strike him in the head with a bowling ball. And he did, it's not aggressive, he pushed it out into my son and hit my son in the head, and my son can't put up his hands. The obligation of the district was to correct that. My right as a parent to know what they did to correct it was non-existent, exactly. So we sort of have the same thing here, which is a claim of a discriminatory act against a professional staff member. I have no right to know that it's a personnel matter, unless it rises to the level that we need to take action, in which case Robert would make a recommendation to the board, and then we become that trier of fact we spoke of before. So if we live in a bifurcated world, unfortunately, for that.
Well, okay, so I see in terms of the board level, but even for Robert, even at the superintendent level, are all these incidents being documented? Like if something happens in a school, in elementary school, there's an incident that happens, is that being documented and then passed on to, the principal and on up to the compliance officer and on up to the superintendent? So even excluding the board from this instance, just in terms of general documentation, we feel there's a gap there, and maybe that should be in the policy as well. And even kind of related points, sorry to kind of connect these points, but when you were speaking earlier about the practice of things making it to the compliance officer, even the wording in the policy right now today is very kind of, if you feel like it.
The new policy or the?
Yeah, I'm looking at new policy, page 2, step 1, reporting. A lot of the wording here is complaints may also be made directly to the compliance officer. Students are encouraged to immediately report the incident to the building principal. The next paragraph, complaints may also be made directly to the compliance officers. I think the may and encourage should be changed to should, must, shall.
I can't put that on a student that they must report.
Yeah.
Well, this is specifically speaking about a student or third party.
Right.
Now, when we come down into the second, I can't obligate a student or third party with any weight. Well, now, a school employee who suspects shall immediately, and that one says shall immediately report the incident.
Right.
So those persons over whom I have domain
But
are
then it says-
bound.
Right, but then it says complaints may also be made to the compliance officer. So that kind of shows that, yes, it will go to the principal, but it may or may not
Make it.
go to the compliance officer.
The next line says the principal shall report.
Shall immediately notify. So upon receiving a complaint, the principal must immediately notify the compliance officer. Like, they cannot pass go until they call the compliance officer. And in practice, that's what it looks like today. They do not do a single thing until they call myself, Barry, or Sue.
It's actually funny because it's actually in there twice, because it says it at the bottom, step 1, shall report directly, and the first step in step 2 in the investigation is shall report immediately to the compliance officer. It's redundant.
Remember, employees are,
Student.
With the third party.
Right,
So
so
they're encouraged to go to the principal,
Mhm.
or alternatively, to go into the principal, they may just go skip the principal.
Right, okay.
And go straight to the compliance officer.
Understood. And then second paragraph, school
Is the
employee.
principal must go to the compliance officer.
it's on step 2 investigation. Upon receiving a complaint of
Wait.
discrimination, the principal shall immediately notify the compliance officer. The compliance officer shall authorize. So they can't.
Okay, so it's just different layers to it, but
Yeah.
it's together, it's there, exactly.
And
About
then
that.
to ease your mind a little bit too, remember that school employees are mandated reporters, so they're required by law if there is something happening to report.
Right, and just
So
wanted
like
to
that's
match
another safeguard that you want to keep in mind is, and then back to your question about
the
what do our
documentation.
documentations look like? I think we've heard administrative reg several times. That's definitely an administrative reg piece, not a policy piece, because that wouldn't belong in policy, but I can only speak from my compliance officer duties and not for others, although I know they have similar practices. We have a binder that's put together that encompasses all of our materials. And I also have a handbook that I give to employees. I wouldn't call it a handbook, but I give instruction sheets to principals on how to investigate and how to collect the documentation. So the compliance officer, Barry could speak to how he does it from his,
It's very similar.
with his flair, or how Sue does it, but they're very guided. And then the end product is put together by the compliance officer in a binder with all of the materials. And then we keep it so that, down the road, if I get another complaint about the same person, I'm gonna pull that out and say, okay, I have one here, now I have this one.
In the realm of violence, we have mandatory reporting to the state level, to PDE, and suspensions and expulsions, because it's typically also stem from violence as well. There is nothing in the realm of discrimination claims at this point at the state level. There's no mandatory reporting. I'm just asking, I don't know.
No.
Just wonder. This is a learning experience, not only setting policy.
One comment that I was going to make about 10 minutes ago, and it does relate to reporting of initial reporting of incidents, and it's a suggestion that I ask you to consider, and we would ask you to consider, is having a website portal to make these complaints. Making it as easy as possible for a student who doesn't feel comfortable talking to the teacher for whatever reason. Maybe the student doesn't feel comfortable talking to the principal. Maybe the student doesn't feel comfortable talking to anybody, but the student will go onto the website and with parent or without, fill out a complaint. And you can make, fields in the form mandatory. So for example, you're not going to take anonymous complaints. You're going to require that they identify the alleged perpetrator. You're going to require that they put in a narrative, date, time, location, witnesses, and, you can't submit the form unless the fields are completed. So I've worked with other organizations and agencies that have, ethics reporting obligations, and this is a way that we advise our clients all the time. And I think it's just a real easy way to get information directly to the person who needs to have it.
Do you have any studies that show that those actually make a difference? Because all the studies that I've read, these going back a couple of years, those kind of reporting mechanisms, there's no significant difference because the person has to put in all that information to submit the form. A lot of times they don't want to put down in writing, they just want to talk to someone, they don't want to put it down in writing.
I don't have studies, I just have anecdotal experience that it's effective in gathering real, information about.
Hey, can I make just one question and a suggestion? First off, do we have any kind of reporting lines for anything, whether it be a phone line or an email for any type of situation today?
Email, yes, but that's really it.
Just a direct email to somebody?
Right.
Okay. So my suggestion would be, we've got getting some great input from these folks, which I would not have even thought about, and they want to present. So does it make sense to schedule a separate meeting, whether, if you have quorum, obviously we have to advertise it. If not, to do some work, to have more of a work session with these folks to flesh some of this stuff out rather than
Yeah,
look at the agenda that you're trying to get through now and respect the incredible
I feel bad for Chuck, but
work
it's
product that we're
Don't feel
getting.
bad for me, I'm fine. Conversation.
But I hear,
Because I can only imagine on the other policies what kind of great input we're going to get.
well, the other policies.
And the one that they're going to introduce, we don't even.
Truthfully, much less involved. and not quite, the public concern is slightly
Isn't it
less.
just the website? I think that kind of stuff goes in the administrative regs. I saw everybody running it down. I think it's a great idea. I would be for it just because it's easy. I mean, you can always email people, but if you were a fifth grader, you didn't know who to email. I don't know. There's nothing
I think-
negative.
yeah,
about
I
it.
think-
It's not
I think
negative
it's
besides the
perfect,
work it
yeah.
takes to post it and somebody to ban it, but I'm not opposed to it, but how that functionally happens, website might be good this year, 2 years from now, it might be text,
For
might
right
be
now,
God knows
yeah.
what.
For
So
right now,
I feel like.
But I think the other, just to think about, I mean, if you think about,
people on the phone are gonna have trouble following, so right.
Jerry, so just to follow up on Wendy's point, but not just elements of, harassment or discrimination. I think anything that's out there
Sure.
associated with
Let's-
any of our care programs. I mean, I got phone calls this morning from parents saying, hey, who do I call if I know something about whatever? So maybe there's some things that we have that there's not awareness around, but by identifying a hotline of some sort, or maybe a series of, like.
Let's,
I'd
so where you
rather
get
put it
to
on the
that's
web.
vehicles,
let's
but-
put,
I'd
let's,
rather put it on the web where they have to put their name in,
let's,
because otherwise we are gonna spend a lot of time.
I'm not
chasing-
suggesting what the vehicle is, I'm just saying.
here's the thing. Let me,
No,
for the purposes of the core function that we're doing today, that's not gonna be top line priority at this point. I think we have to pick and choose our battles.
Understood.
So I think I'm gonna recommend that we concentrate on what we've got. The second thing, just to make you aware, we entertained that in 99, 2000, we had a school safety task force, and we entertained that sort of reporting. And we were quickly dissuaded from that by a number of police and law enforcement agencies, not on this topic, but on the topic. And part of it was because the anonymous nature of it prompted it to be used as a retribution device for children and others to attack other children by putting in somebody else's name.
Well,
And they should create a S-storm you wouldn't believe, because I put in Wendy's name and made a complaint about him against her, and it became a storm. And it became, we've all seen, I don't know if you've seen it, I think it's called slapping or something, which is where they call in the SWAT team.
yeah,
Swatting. They call in the SWAT team to go to someone's house, and that poor guy is on a video game getting their videos of it. So I want to avoid that. Let's concentrate on this. We're going to park that one for the time being, that notion. I think that you were coming to the conclusion of your
well,
commentary on one of
there were
the.
just two other areas. One was on criminal reporting. I'm in agreement with you that if the initial report suggests that there is a crime may have committed, it needs to be reported to the police immediately.
We got that going.
Okay. And right now, there appears to be no particular time frame or limit on an investigation in terms of from initial report to completion. And I know that arbitrary timelines can be really damaging, but maybe to say something about how soon after an incident is reported, it needs to be resolved and completed. Is there a section where, that timeframe is listed?
Yes.
Where is that?
Under step 3, investigative report, the principal shall prepare and submit a written report to the compliance officer within 15 days.
That should be changed to the investigator.
Okay, sure, yeah. I'm gonna make the refinements that we've been talking
Right.
about.
Yeah, so
And then,
that's actually for the investigation. That's
right,
the
and
building.
then stay with me, okay? And then on the last page, the compliance officer shall review the investigation. And then they also have within 15 days, they can file an appeal. So following your line of thought, the other policy did have a deadline for when to respond. So that deadline was, I think, 60 days. And you're right, it is missing here. So that is a gap we should fill, in my opinion, too.
I want to make you aware of one thing, which is important consideration, and we have encountered this previously in other things that we are aware of as a board. We don't have subpoena power, and we cannot compel testimony. So we have an opportunity to run into that, not only for people who choose to enact that from a Fifth Amendment perspective, but also from people who just choose to be non-reporting, not even though there's no personal exposure for them for a criminal or a civil matter, they just choose not to become involved. So we are always bound and burdened by that. We try, but that's just, understand the sea in which we swim.
So just to clarify, under investigative report, the way that it's written is that building principal has 15 days, and then the compliance officer shall inform the accused and the complainant of the outcome. So it's meant to be at 15 days, then we then inform the person. So I'll refine that a little bit so it reads clearly, because it should be on that 16th day, the complainant knows. But you're right, it's hard to find.
Yeah.
But if I was complying with this policy, I would read that to say that I have 15 days from the time I complete my investigation as the administrator to write the report. I thought I heard you're talking about the length of the investigation
from the
itself.
time of-
And that's why I was shaking my head, only because even as a board member, I've seen most things are done in, maybe we could say 15 days or whatever you guys feel is comfortable for a relatively short time. But we've been exposed to some investigations that we've had because of the nature and scope of them. They've actually taken several months, not unhappily on our side. But, so if we did want to put an average or something, I'd be fine, but I wouldn't, because I've heard of it and seen investigations that could never have dreamed up in my wildest dreams. I wouldn't want to put an absolute definitive time frame on the
What I would lobby for or suggest is, we'll set a deadline. Those items that go beyond the deadline require the superintendent to make a presentation to the board president and vice president, which allows us to maintain a quorum to be the triers of fact. They would not then sit on anything, but at least that would allow the president, vice president of the board to be aware and help the superintendent to steer.
Yeah, those
to
cases
steer
we were
what-
all aware.
Yeah, no, I'm saying if it's gone long.
Yeah.
If anything that's gone beyond the limit that we set.
So I think, and I agree with everything, so you have the 15 days to get the investigation done and get the report to the compliance officer. If everything goes the way it should.
Well, Chuck's saying it doesn't read that way.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I want to refine it.
Okay.
Refine it.
That's what you
so
intended it to
that it reads the way it's intended, and then you have that caveat language unless additional time
Right.
is needed, but I think what our practice is, and we should include it here, is that we keep the complainant informed. And that's a really important piece, because then if not, the parent or the student or the staff member feels like no one cares. So I'll put something in that's more reflective of how we do it. Because like Wendy said, it absolutely can drag on sometimes, especially if it becomes a legal matter or a
And then it's out of
matter.
our control. So finding those lines is the hard.
And that's the only other thing that I would think to consider here is if it's turned over to police reporting or to the DA's office.
All bets are off.
Well, actually, we are often requested to step back.
Sure.
So that at all times, what's the legal term? Not pen, there's another term. It's often used in lease agreements where you don't know, you can't act on the complaint because there's a legal term for it. I can't think of what it is. But we actually will have to step back on that. We are restricted by the police department and the DA's office from making further inquiries at all in that space because they don't want us to taint.
And our administration is restricted from sharing.
Yeah.
Right. And there's actually language in the old policy, page 6 of 8, number 6 at the bottom. When law enforcement authorities request cessation of fact gathering, then the district shall notify the complainant and accused of the suspension of the investigation. And this actually speaks to 60 days in there.
I'm good with incorporating some of that notion into what we're looking at here.
If I could comment, the other thing as in dealing with this, for the policy committee to consider is you have a harassment policy, you have a bullying policy, you have a discrimination policy, you have it for support staff, you have a professional staff, administrative staff. The language needs to be consistent between them because depending on which policy I go to, I might go in a different direction, and often in these cases, it's open to interpretation as to whether you're going to decide it's harassment, bullying, or what have you. So just as you go through them, they should be consistent in what we're supposed to do in this situation. Some will tell you go to this, to direct to the superintendent, some will say, go to the
Should
compliance
we bring
officer.
them all back?
So
They should come together.
just to jump on that, Chuck, that's one of the things that PSBA is doing for us, is they're making sure that the language is consistent between those different policies. And the 3, 4, 5, 6, 700, all the employee sections, the 3 employee sections, the support staff, professional staff, administrative staff, all of those policies are being collapsed. So there'll be one policy, and then in the policy, if something's unique for support staff, it'll say, there'll be a paragraph for support staff or for professional staff or for administrative staff. So that, those 3 sections are being collapsed. And then your comment about, all the other policy stuff, that's one of the things that she's supposed to be doing, is making sure that that language, so unless we change it and make it inconsistent, it should be consistent.
Because I think the harassment was just revised, maybe it's without
It was.
PSBA's involvement, but there's, like an addict, there's a little innuendo in there that's different.
Harassment and bullying listed.
So I just said, Jerry, I think we should take a look, bring this back to policy committee and take a look at all of those. And that be the, so we see them all together.
Right.
And that's fine, because this policy, 103, was done in conjunction with those ones,
Okay.
intentionally.
If
For
you
them to
guys
work
can
together.
tell me that that's already consistent, but if you see inconsistency.
No, I think it makes sense. I
Okay.
think it's a good
Actually, just my
recommendation.
foreshadowing here was, this is going to come back for a discussion at this table again.
Right.
And I anticipate that when they talk to us in a little while, if we ever get to it, about about their recommendations around the transgender consideration. If we take that and look at that, that'll be part and parcel of the same thing, probably at our next meeting, if it'll fit in.
So policy 103 will
Come back.
be back in April, the April policy committee.
Correct.
Okay.
So that'll give Christine a little time to work on it.
And then bringing back bullying, harassment at that time as well.
Yeah, we just need to know if we passed them already, then just bring us what we passed, so we can just lay all 3 out and say, how would somebody know which policy to look at? Have we defined them well
Are you
enough?
bullied because of this? It's the interplay of,
I think it's a great idea.
So then 103, one's gonna have to come back with good.
Depends, we haven't gotten to
let's look at 103.1. Let's look at least, so at least we give some craft into it.
There was one other piece on
Yeah, give them a chance to
One
walk
of-
through it, yeah. I thought you were gonna bring it back in April, and
In for
I'm
a
gonna come back
penny,
and
for a
tell you
pound.
then, and
Let's
that's
go.
helpful, go ahead.
It's around accountability, and there's already been some discussion about it. And we understand that you certainly can't be sharing the names of complainants or people accused of violating a discrimination policy, or witnesses, or anything like that, or even the specifics. But to the point Jerry was talking about earlier, we think that it would be healthy for the board and potentially the public to receive reports that would essentially identify the statistics for time periods, whether it's every 6 months or every quarter, whatever, basically saying what the nature of the reported incident is. In other words, discrimination complaint, what the category is, how many days it took to be concluded, and whether, a basic finding, founded, unfounded, or substantiated, unsubstantiated, whatever your finding categories are, just so that there is some light on what's going on in the district.
For me, I would understand the idea. I want to withhold a thought on it until I see the volume. Because if the incidence rate, is low, then it's going to identify, just because of the incidence rate being low in a public report, people will be able to look at it and go, oh yeah, that was when Sally did this, and that was when Johnny did that. So you're right, if I got up to a point or a time frame that gives me sufficient number that will obscure that, we have that same problem for reporting performance around children's performance on standardized tests. Under a certain number, we don't report it, because I could look and say, well, it's a multiply handicapped kid with it's body, and I would know that. So I'm gonna, for me, once we see the volume, and I guess we could say it's only as good as our word, in a year, I'm not calling it a year, but in a year, to look at what the volume is to see if it's obscuring enough. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So
I do think if the superintendent's reporting to the board, 99% of what we get is reported through a public meeting. So if we're at, I mean, it's not to say, I understand the differential, because theoretically, Robert would say, here's a board update, and here's this you're supposed to get every 6 months. But I would say we get, most of what we get in that's a reporting of district is then done at the board table, which becomes part of board docs and a public meeting. Yeah. So I don't want to discount it, but I do want to let you know that that's true. I can't remember ever getting reporting on the district that then didn't become public if you keep up with
Sure.
board. The only point I would add to that, and it's just under consideration, and kind of, I hear Jerry's comment, and also we need additional administrative help in this district, as you've probably heard us talk about, is workload, and this is important enough to be reported, but it'd be, I think ultimately, if you had a section on the website that said diversity, and this is what the district does, and this is the report, like, that would probably be our, well, I won't speak for everybody else, but I would love to have that. I am being very honest to say, I am sensitive to how much work I put on administration that I think is short-staffed now. So it's just balancing how soon can we get all the things we want them to do done. And I'm not trying to diminish the importance of this, but I'm just being frank. So I think you shouldn't think it's not going to be public, because most of what he reports to us at district level is. But I think the long-term goal is to say, this is where Council Washington is on diversity, these are our policies, these are our records. Kind of, this is who we are, right? This is what's happening.
Trust me, it's a terrible word. I think part of it is that we have to start at an aggregate. How can we grossly aggregate them? District-wide, we can probably do it.
Yeah.
And not until we get to see the volume, because the next question would be my next question, which is, well, how does North compare to South? How does Hall compare to Newtown? How does Welch compare to, because that was the next follow-on. I don't want to get to that level, because I don't think we have the volume to support that at this point. But at a gross aggregated level, probably you don't have to wait so long. I mean, it's, you know, and the metrics you have are not a bad idea of how long, you know, and we would denude it of the time of the date it was reported, which would also help to obscure. It's going to be very gross level.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't feel like we can, for me, I don't feel like we can or should lose sight of the fact that we can and will continue to look at these policies and put all of these things in place. The most important thing that we have to do, which I don't even know how it can be driven by policy, policy can only be improved, is not allow time to pass and culture to replace, you know, to go back to the discussions we had earlier about things replacing, culture coming into play and things becoming accepted over time that we didn't know was happening. And should we, shame on us and all of those discussions, and I can appreciate all of that, but the reinforcement of this has to come as much through policy as it does culture in order for all of us to be successful together, in my opinion. And it can come with a hammer in terms of these policies, but it's the culture we have to work on and the reinforcement of what it is we are trying to achieve and how we're all going to get there together as much as this is important. And I'm not discounting how important this is. And that I'm not 100% sure on how to do.
Well, I know we've all talked about it as our part of our group, is that having the policy helps to kind of force those that are against the culture that we want, right? So if the policy is there, they have no choice. If the policy is gray or it's not there, then they do what they want to do.
So I guess I would say this to you, and I may be naive, and I recognize that. I don't know that we had in this particular year a great number of people resistant to policy as places where people didn't speak up because it was either easier, because culture created a universe where you stopped hearing something, or what you were hearing did not carry the same weight. I do it with my own kids sometimes. So I can only imagine what it's like in an organization of this size with this many people. So
I was gonna say, I think that if you sat through the town halls, you did recognize a breakdown in following policy.
Yes,
So,
and I'm not owning that. I am not owning that, but I don't think we had people that didn't want to follow policy. For the most part. I think what we had was people who became comfortable with the culture that sort of changed and evolved over time and became more, that didn't hear things through quite the same lens that they would have a few years prior. That's all I'm saying. I'm not suggesting, I don't think we have an organization as a whole that doesn't want what we all want, that all of us sitting in this room. I believe that what we can all become tone deaf. And I don't know how to prevent tone deaf over time and not hearing what we should hear and not hearing things in the background that you should be picking up on and taking a step and following up on and going to compliance officers and people. That's my great fear, is all of this we can do and should.
Well, Robert, I don't know if the council arts scorecard that we initially put together to talk about who we want to be, set goals, how we're going to do about that. I don't know where we are with that right now, but this sounds to me like potentially an opportunity to address something. I think everybody is expressing an interest to say, hey, we'd be curious to see what's coming up through the system. We don't know what that size is. I would just say, hey, you're running the show here. You're seeing everything with the compliance officers. You guys get things together when you're ready to show it to us and suggest to us what the right frequency is, knowing that we want to see it. If it's appropriate to put into a public document, great. Depending on what Chicago says, what the content is.
Right.
But that could be one.
That could be an appropriate venue for it.
Yeah.
All right. In the interest of time.
I'm sorry, one last thing. To the earlier comment about the website, it's kind of a side comment. It's something that we've also talked about a lot. We would love to be able to help, put something together that would, accomplish multiple goals of kind of putting that, this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is our, our related diversity policies and statements. We think that's important too.
Dude, yes, my T skills? No, just
We-
kidding.
we-
Matt can use some help.
We do in our group, we do.
Some donated IT skills, because IT skills are very expensive.
All right, let's try and make a little bit of time. I have to tell you, on this policy, I am confused. First of all, I want to be interested in disclosure. My name's on the bottom of every one of these policies. It's not true. It's not true. But here's my question on this policy. I think the PSBA is throwing everything in. So I'm glad you're here.
To the next one?
Yeah, we're going to go to 103.1.
Yeah.
Which was, this previously talked about treating persons with disabilities fairly. This now has become everything from due process. Chuck, this looks like, a document where you're trying to explain on your resume what you do. So I'm trying to figure out what, it's all Chuck's fault. I'm trying to figure out, don't we have this covered elsewhere in another policy about all the procedures and procedural safeguards around IDEA, 504, FERPA, all the lovely things? The old policy was kind of like, be nice to people, and the new one is, I'm not being overly facetious here, but the new one is
9-page.
yeah, it's, the law didn't change, but I just want to make sure that we're talking
exactly
about
what
the policy
he's-
that's a one-to-one.
Christine, did you modify this one?
I really looked at this very briefly because it's not in my area, so I made the assumption that Chuck was looking at it.
All right, I think we're gonna kind of post 103.
We could, because this is gonna sound very elementary, but my name wasn't next to it, so when I scanned the list, I just didn't pick up on that.
You wouldn't
Originally-
have it to do the content of the old one.
Okay.
So I'm gonna,
You are correct, that on a quick glance, much of this exact language is in other policies.
I'm gonna take this, we're gonna put this
So you
aside for
two can
now.
work together, figure that
So
out.
all the deference came, but this became really the handbook for the special education group in the organization. And we're gonna put it aside so Chuck can have a little better look and a coordinated look.
So I'll change the name responsible for that to Dr. Lambert and move that up to the next meeting.
Because for what it was, well, let's just take it from this perspective really quickly. The old 103.1, is it now incorporated in our 103 that we're proposing? The old language of the, because this new 103.1 is a whole different beast. So looking at it quickly, let's take a moment just to look at the 103.1 old and see if it's a different beast in its entirety. Yeah, that's, it's encompassed for its protections for the policy under the last of the authority or purpose to provide equal access to facilities operated by the district and provide comparable facility services and activities provided to a non-disabled person. Because this is not a student policy, this 103.1, the old. It had to do with equal access for the public as well to our facilities, to building the ramp over at the high school for the stadium. That was covered in this one. This new one is specifically a student-centered policy. So it'll come back to us, but this policy, I think, is the 103.1 old is largely incorporated in what we've got here. And the other thing is entirely about education law for persons with disabilities. Okay? So it'll come back, but it probably should not be 103.1. It should not come back under that number because it relates in a, Chuck, I'm looking to you for a nod. It relates in an entirely different mode than discriminatory behaviors. It is enacting aspects of special education.
Agreed.
Okay. So it'll come back under a different number, I think. Mike, you all right?
Yeah.
Everybody okay with that? I'm sorry, I feel like I'm dictating to everybody. But.
Thanks, Viv.
104, the Affirmative Action Program for Employment and Contract Services. Christine, this is back to you. This is your wheelhouse. So.
I wanted to point out really briefly that between 103 and 104, our listing of who we shall not discriminate against is slightly different. So I wanted to seek some direction on, do we want to make our list of the categories upon which we will not discriminate uniform. So just very quickly, and not to go back to 103 and belabor it. In 104, we say genetic information, but we don't include marital status. In 103, we have marital status, but not genetic information.
Philosophically, I don't want to discriminate against anybody, so stick anybody you want. Like,
Well,
right? Like this becomes so long, it's like everybody's in at least one of the
like
categories, like,
Anybody.
right, I feel like it should be anybody for anything.
So I'll fix 103 to match 104.
Well, let me ask you a question before you rush to do that. Not that I would not do it, but I don't know what our current practice is. This is non-discrimination in employment and contract practices. As it stands, I don't even know, so I don't even know. Do we provide, because marital status is not here, right? Do we provide partner benefits to non-married employees?
We do not.
So the inclusion of marital status would then obligate us, what are you looking at?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm an idiot on this stuff. So, but it would obligate us to provide benefits for non-married staff members to their domestic partner, if that's still a current term. I have no idea.
So if somebody legally establishes a domestic partner,
I don't know that that's possible in the state of Pennsylvania, so go ahead, keep going with that thought.
Like same-sex marriage is legal
Yeah.
throughout the
Well,
country.
here's my dilemma on marital status.
Yeah.
Here's my dilemma on marital status included here from that perspective. When DOMA was, Defense of Marriage Act was a predominant in the nation, that meant that persons of the same gender couldn't marry, and that's why domestic partnership benefits came into existence. With the the Supreme Court decisions, which have basically castrated DOMA, now marriage is open to all individuals. And so the provision of benefits for non-married domestic partners is on the cusp of not being allowed anymore, because it was provided to get around the discrimination for homosexuals who couldn't get their lover or their partner in life benefits. Now that marriage is open to everyone, that may be on the cusp of not being available anymore. So I'm not expressing my personal opinion one way or the other. I'm trying to look at it as being a fiduciary for the school district of putting that out there. Also, by the way, including it at this point would potentially be a change to a negotiated contract. And I need to be careful about what I do about our contracts with our labor organizations, because if suddenly now I'm offering partner benefits, that becomes past practice. If it becomes problematic. So this is really, I'm
Seems
not
like
returning, but this is the problem I need.
Something you need your solicitors.
Exactly. So that's why
Bottom line.
I hear the point, but I want to be very careful about that.
If you bring a marriage certificate, your partner will be covered regardless of
Gender.
gender.
That's the question
Yeah,
after that. Okay, good.
absolutely.
Right.
Not ever.
Okay.
But we don't provide domestic partners.
Good, okay. No, but we
Like you
provide
said,
marriage.
that would definitely be more of a collective bargaining discussion if we wanted to include domestic partners.
So I need to be careful about that. It seems very good and forthright, but it has, when I look at the fellow who went to law school, to say it has complications on that one.
No, I think your point is good. I think the spirit of the intent is there. Being consistent.
The other ones, the other categories I have, I don't have, those tend to fall under the federal regulations. And even the inclusion of the one we spoke of before regarding gender identity or gender expression, that still falls within this space. I don't have a huge problem around that. I'm sorry, Christine, I feel like I stole away from you.
My direction then is to,
I would not include marital status at this point until we speak with Rob.
It's, it's crazy because this list of regardless of is just going to keep getting bigger as life goes on. Can't we just get away with the word, but the policy this district provide to all persons equal access, period, all persons.
To human beings.
You know, not exactly. I mean, it's silly I mean, until we get to a situation where it's head, we're good.
I would just leave that in Rob's lap.
You know, it is interesting too, because again, it is an interesting thing when you look at the physical and mental impairments that constitute disabilities, because there are certain mental illnesses that would, by its nature, not be a person you would want to hire to be in amongst children because of either self-harm or so it is an interesting path to go down. As a person who's an advocate for persons with disability, it is an interesting problem. And you know, that if someone, you know, is a controlled central nervous system issue, that's fine, but they don't take their meds, then they become a danger. So I don't know. We'll leave it as it is, but it is interesting. I don't know how you're gonna.
But regardless, it should match, right?
It should.
I mean,
That's
so
that was
that
my
was
only-
Christine's whole point, is that whatever we ultimately decide we're gonna say in one, we should say in all.
With the exception of
That's it.
marriage,
thank you.
marital status, yes.
Okay, on this policy, I actually used the technology correctly, Matt left with the so please. And you can see where I made the changes because they have the line through them. So on page 2, I added language regarding reporting. And this was similar to the conversation we had around 103, that who to refer the complaint to if the principal's not the right person to do the investigation. I had inserted the director of HR there. And then,
So even though it's crossed out, that's what you're at.
that's showing where my changes are.
Okay.
So I used it correctly. In the last one, you couldn't see what I did. So this one you can. And that is another change there that I added. The rest are from PSBA.
So it's in employment and contract practices. And my only concern around that is that somehow employment and contract practices is already under the hat of the HR director as the party responsible for the action. So what, is that a cross out to the point in step one? Is that crossed out or is that supposed to be underlined or bolded that you added that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have, well, I was thinking
That's
about a more important problem than your typography. So my question here is, do we, if it's in this realm, should it go to the Director of Employment of Human Resources, who would have been in line with hiring potentially, or should this go to the Assistant Superintendent, I'll pick a name at this point, who is not necessarily, I'm not.
We could absolutely change it. My thinking around it was that when you're screening, interviewing, hiring, promotions, that they are not the sole or even sometimes any discretion of human resources, but rather comes from the administrative team.
I would agree.
That's my understanding.
That is
You're
our
only
function.
saying go past go. Who gets selected after that is
Right.
up to the building.
That's far more of a principal function.
Okay, sorry, I was focusing on the principal one and thinking it was the general one. I apologize.
My logic would be that if the principal is the person who say didn't promote
No,
or
I
discriminated.
was taking what was the principal one and thinking it was the general one,
And
which wouldn't they? Nope.
another refinement that's actually called out here that was not on the other one is on the last page. When we talk about the outcome and the outcome being conveyed to the accuser or to the complainant, I had included in both policies that will happen by the compliance officer, because that person is properly trained and able to deliver the right information to the complainant and the accused. So while your principal or your designee is doing the investigation and writing a report, the compliance officer will be the conduit for the district in delivering the outcome.
But yes, you need to look at the appeal procedures and treat those 15-day windows the same as we talked about in the last discussion.
For this sort of claim, does our school board, does our insurance policy come into play? Do we have insurance that covers us for acts like this? The only reason I ask is if we have an insurance policy that covers employment practices, I think we do. I'm not sure if we do, but I think we might. There should be some aspect here of notification in this, built into this of counsel, so that counsel would then advise our insurance on a potential claim, because if we don't have a timely filing, then we don't get coverage. So I'm not sure what we're covered from an employment practices policy, but
Yeah, that makes sense.
can we just check to see if we have some aspect of employment practices under an insurance policy? And if it does, then we need to add some notation here regarding timely notification of our counsel, who would then be obligated to notify if appropriate. Other comments, questions, answers?
Can we make comment on this one? Or?
Well, I have a question, which is development of position qualifications, job descriptions, essential functions. And one of the things which has been a particular bug of mine for a long time is, do we have a periodic review of job descriptions within this organization?
So within our CRESPA unit, in their employment contract, they do maintain some ownership over the job description process. So when we develop job descriptions, the job descriptions are taken to a representative group of the CRESPA employees, who then have the ability to either approve or not approve. So the answer is yes, the review is periodic and slow at best, given that process that's contractual. Another conversation for another day would be refining that language so that we have more freedom to develop, review, and adapt our job descriptions as needed.
My question really focused, looking at the title of this document, really on, at one time, we had a job description which required the person to be able to use their hand to detect the texture of something. This was a warehouseman or someone who's a receiving clerk. This has been years ago. So, and I went nuts then, and I was told, well, that's the phrase, that's how it's phrased, and I'm like, no, because that's discriminatory.
Those have been updated. I'd
Okay.
be happy to share them with you. They're, more concise now.
Well, that they'd be more acceptable to the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of the ability to sense. There were still things in some of them that said the ability to lift, and the appropriate language is the ability to move. So that's my question. I'm not asking that they all be fixed momentarily, but that there be a cycle for review to.
Which does exist.
Okay.
It's slower than I would like because of some of the curtailments from the contract, but they have been done rather recently. And
Okay.
I believe that they're more concise and more in alignment with what you're looking for, but would be happy to show them to you.
I'm just trying to make sure that we don't get backed up on that, so that I would think you're responsible to monitor the implementation of non-discriminatory procedures in the following areas. So does that mean that there's a review of those items by you? So it's by the compliance officer?
But again, it's by committee. So when we review primarily for our support staff, which is where we have the most diversity in positions. So with our professional unit, you have teacher of regular ed, teacher of special ed, counselor. In our support staff, we have much more diversity of classification.
Do you sign off? Does the compliance officer sign off on job descriptions?
It is a dual process where the union must approve the job description. So no, I do not have authority to unilaterally sign off.
Are you one of the signatories on the job descriptions?
No, they
That's-
are really the.
I hear you say that, but that's where I would like, that's what I'm getting to, which is by having the compliance officer review them to make sure that the language of the job descriptions, because that I have the union sign off on it is great, but if the job description is still, to take the example, which we believe has been corrected regarding using your fingers to do something, if that's still in the job description, that's not on the union, that's on us. So I'm looking.
So I'll just reiterate, because I think I'm maybe not answering you as clearly as I should. I believe our job descriptions are ADA compliant. And yes, I do review them and am part of that process. I am not the sole approver, it is a committee process.
I understand.
And Christine, what you're saying is the reason why CRESPA signs off on those is because it's in the contract.
Yes.
I understand.
Contract language.
Okay, I'm not going to beat this, but belabor this, but my point was, who signs off on that for the district to say that the district has accepted it before? That the union signed off on it, that's great. Who's the last signatory? It has to be, my point would be, it has to be dual signed. Once by the district. Obviously, the ultimate answer is like the check register, which is, well, we approve it when we hire the person. Well, we don't look at the job descriptions when we hire the person. We look at the title of the job when we hire the person. I'm just looking for that level of.
Me. I don't physically sign it, so I'm just trying to be accurate,
Okay.
neither do they. But we come to agreement that this is the job description that both the union and the district agree to. It's not actually signed.
Okay.
Sign.
What?
They don't sign ours either. If you approve them, if you both approve them, then it's a job description, it goes up
And
on
it's
the.
adopted and it goes from draft to.
Right, so the adoption is what does it.
When I put it on the web to advertise, that
You
my
sign
HR person has to sign it,
Yeah, we don't,
Yeah,
because they want to make sure we have included language, which is.
I'm just saying, we don't sign anything.
All right. Anybody else have comments? Because I think that's too many.
Yes.
Nope.
Yes.
Ready to go to public? We'll go to public now. Hey, go ahead.
Not much on this one really, but the only thing, just again, comparing to what was in the old policy, which just think was kind of critical to maintain, is that within the section, page 1, delegation of responsibility, in terms of the compliance officer is responsible to monitor the implementation of non-discrimination procedures in the following areas. So it lists the areas and probably in practice and in theory that covers everything, but the previous policy was more descriptive to ensure that the analysis and the reporting on progress and the ability to make the recommendations to the board was very present and able to be done. And think about this 10 years from now, if Robert Frazier is no longer here and a new superintendent comes in and let's say wants to do something totally different, if it's not clear in the policy, he doesn't have to do analysis, do reporting on progress, or choose to make any recommendations to improve affirmative action type of policy. And in regards to what's in the old policy, I'm talking about under the responsibility section on page 1, it shall be the duty of the superintendent or the affirmative action officer to monitor, and 1, 2, and 3 is job analysis, employment analysis, and promotional analysis. Again, they're covered in theory in the new policy, but the old policy was very descriptive to cover the analysis, the reporting on progress, and making recommendations. Actively making recommendations, I think, is important. Whereas the new policy only says it's monitored. You can look at it, oh, it's bad, great. But there's no analysis, there's no reporting.
Yeah, the get out of jail free card on the old one at the bottom was the last 2 words on page 1 of 3. It was as needed, so get out of jail. So, it
Good point.
It had a lot of teeth, but then that made the teeth made out of rubber,
No, good point. I didn't even catch that. Good point. Yeah, it should just be done.
Anybody have a feeling for that one way or the other?
I'll just very briefly say, I think that PSBA recommends more concise language because then the language, when it's more specific, becomes dated. Some of the things, when you look at the review copy used in recruiting ads and application forms, it becomes dated over time.
I guess the thing I would say is if we just said monitor and report on, you're supposed, I don't think this would be the case with you, Christine, but to the point of Joe Schmo comes in and we say, well, we find something wrong. And they're like, yeah, I was monitoring it, but I wasn't reporting it back. I don't think it has to go into specifics, i.e. there was a get out of jail free card on the last one, but we certainly can say, you're supposed to obviously monitor and then if they're there, report it back. I mean, it seems obvious to us, but I don't think you could just say monitor, review, and report any notable. I think to your point, it should be expected, but that's what we get with these policies.
Yeah, it needs to be clear.
We either go one way, we either go so general because we think it's so obvious, or we go so specific it becomes outdated. It's like finding that line.
And just to be clear, not really trying to sign you up for every little detail that was in that old policy, but just the mindset behind reporting on progress, making recommendations.
I think you would assume that monitor means monitor, analysis, report back anything of significance, but the next person maybe doesn't. So anyway, It might be a happy medium there.
So you could say the compliance officer is responsible to monitor, review, and make necessary recommendations and changes.
Fine.
Does that sound good?
Period. Yeah, that sounds good.
That's Schmo's what he would name. Joe Schmo's.
Good to know.
Just so you know that.
Good to know.
I am Joe Schmo.
All right.
We were gonna, okay, you were trying to time.
But I guess just to that point, if anybody at any time feels like there's an issue, then we can direct the administration to do a deep dive into what we currently, so.
Yeah, and so in the last question, I promise.
Yes.
Is how would the public, so in terms of obviously discrimination for an employee, that's fine, but how would an employee or even the public kind of make a request to say, well, hey, we'd like to understand what is going on? What is the reporting? Is there a way to be able to have that, maybe that scorecard that we were talking about earlier?
It is interesting to note just that we received a right to know by someone a few months ago, claiming our required obligation to certain federal programs. They were sadly mistaken. They were just absolutely mistaken. But do you remember this one, Christine? I think, were you here for it, Robert? Somebody in Northampton had requested, a right to know around, and it was not an aspect of law that we're obligated to. You know, how would someone know? People can do right-to-know requests to the district about district records, and if they're a record of the district that's conveniently available, we can produce them. It's hard to know it's hard to know what's reported.
I think anybody who wants to know the information's easy enough. There are email addresses and contacts for virtually not only every person in the administration, but all of the board members. I think the dream question for me, or the ideal is, could we just post stuff so anybody just perusing who didn't think to ask the question but was evaluating the district and might want to know that information? Because the person who wants to know, I don't have any concern that they are going to be able to find it. It's the person who doesn't think to ask or minorly wants to just search, doesn't really want to write to one of the administrators or write to a board member or whatever. How is that information just kind of freely out there? And that just goes back to how much time and energy and information do we have to beef up on the web. To me, there's no lack of information for the person who wants to know. All of us on this board get emails every day from people who want to know something. And 99% of the time, they get the information they're looking for. And I don't even know how many emails you get, so I don't even want to know. So I'm just saying, like, I think it's back to that, could our website just generally have some more information for the person just perusing around versus the person who says, I really want to know this one aspect. If we can tell them, because typically it's, I'm unhappy with X employee of Council Rock and I want to know if anybody else has ever complained. Well, that's a personnel record. No information is going to ever be posted about that, right? So I think the message here is we want to make these policies good, and then any information we can put out publicly that helps beef up general information for the public, we should try to do.
This is such a good time to raise that a lot of what's in policy is also in our collective bargaining agreements.
Yeah.
So much of what you see in policy is then governed by our agreements with our association. So position qualifications, essential qualifications, promotions, those things are governed by the bargaining agreement. And disciplinary action also is governed by the bargaining agreement and then also by school code. So some of this is more transparent than it thinks because we're held accountable to contract and we're held accountable to school code and policy. So there's a great blueprint for what things look like. And our procedures for screening and hiring and interviewing are actually on our website, very transparent. We can put more about how we recruit, where we recruit, but much of what's in here is governed by school code and bargaining.
I'm just trying to work through the topics that we have at hand today. We wanted to allow you to speak briefly. We're not going to go into the depth, the people on the phone don't know what we're talking about. The Diversity Council has asked to talk to us about the transgender policy that they are recommending to the board. The board really is going to just allow them to make a comment about it since we're not going to review the document at this sitting. What I'd like to be able to do, if we could, would just be, and Chuck, I'll do deference to you. I'd like to see if we could get through policies 123.1 and 123.2, which are concussion management and sudden cardiac death, which are kind of the outliers in the remaining policies. Everything else on that is specifically special education. And so, Andy, where you had spoken about to have a special meeting about diversity topics, then one of the forthcoming meetings is going to be expressly just special education. It's going to be the combination of the one we turned back today, which actually, when you look at the policies in the 113 series, is duplicative of many of the things there. Yeah. So I think we're going to really, either we may have a special session, maybe just do special education as a policy committee, if that's all right, if everybody doesn't really get upset about that, maybe a different night, because I think it is an important topic. It is literally 1/4 of our budget each year. And we'll just, and also we will invite, I'll do deference, we'll invite the persons, we'll make it better known among the persons who may be interested with students with disabilities to participate that way, and we'll be outreach on that. So at this point, I'm going to ask you guys to make your brief public comments, which seem to be in writing.
No.
Okay. And then we're going to drop down to 123.1, 123.2, and then we'll wrap it up. So we'll be out of here by 9:30 tonight.
Okay. We also wanted to just volunteer to, defer to the last. I mean, if you
No,
We are, you know,
we're thematic right now. Let's continue. We're on the theme of discriminatory behaviors and diversity, so let's continue that theme. If it's all right with everybody. Everybody's good.
well, we really do appreciate the board's solicitation of our input and consideration and the thoughtful dialogue that we've all had around this table tonight about the policies that we've discussed so far. And, you know, we're encouraged to see, you know, your eagerness to consider our views and what we may have to offer. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with this committee and board to, you know, make the district the best district that it can possibly be. And one of the policies that we are concerned about from a student safety perspective is, well, I should say it's not a policy, it's a lack of a policy for transgender and gender expansive students. And as I mentioned earlier when I read from the Lower Merion School District policy on, and actually to be accurate, the administrative regulation on gender expansive and transgender students is, there's a lot of language that it's important to become familiar with. And defining terms is an important part to understanding the issues. But one thing, you know, and I mentioned this to you, Jerry, in the hall, and I just want to make sure I say it for everyone's benefit. You know, Michael Levin, who I don't know if he currently is, but he certainly was the general counsel for the Pennsylvania School Board Association, published an article in the PSBA Bulletin in January 2016 about this issue. And, you know, there are some statements in the article that are no longer true, okay? For example, there was a statement that a federal court had not yet found in favor of transgender students who have been prohibited from using restrooms or locker rooms that match their gender identity. That happened a few weeks ago in Pittsburgh. The United States District Court in Pittsburgh found in favor of students who were transgender, who were not permitted to use the bathroom that matched their gender identity. They sued, the district court ruled in their favor. There was another case that was pending out of Pittsburgh that was up in the Third Circuit from University of Pittsburgh, which dealt with a university student who had sued the university for the same reason. And there was a description of that case where that student lost in the district court. The same district court just ruled in favor of the students in the K-12 setting. And, you know, so one of the things the author says in this article is, well, it's unclear what's going to happen in the Third Circuit. Well, that case was settled. The case with the University of Pittsburgh was settled. So there will be no Third Circuit opinion out of that case. And even though the terms of settlement are confidential, it's public that the University of Pittsburgh changed policy after that settlement. So I think that gives you a direction of where the lawyers thought that case was going. And, you know, I'm starting with the law probably because it's my crutch. It's easy for me to talk about the law. I'm real comfortable with that. But one of the things that even despite the sort of uncertainty of the legal landscape, in January of 2016, general counsel for, you know, PSBA still wrote, despite all the uncertainty, it is important that these issues be thoroughly thought out in advance rather than on an ad hoc basis. It is strongly recommended that the school board ensure that written guidance that defines the rules is developed and provided to administrators, staff, parents, and students so that all have a consistent awareness of how such issues should be handled and that related policies be reviewed to determine whether amendments are needed to align with the district's adopted approach. So what we are asking for is the district to adopt a policy. And we think it's a matter of student safety because, again, as Jerry and I spoke in the hallway, transgender and gender expansive students sadly have a higher suicide rate. And the kinds of pressures and issues that these students are dealing with are pressures and issues that, frankly, adults in their 40s have, and 50s and 60s have a very hard time dealing with. And it's a lot for the students who are going through, these issues to deal with. And school should be a place where no matter what's going on in a student's life, and what's going on, the struggles that they're having, they should feel safe in school. And they should feel that it's a place where they can be themselves without risk of harm, and any type of harm, whether it be physical harm or emotional harm. And, the concern for some students, particularly middle school students and high school students, is, students aren't even comfortable being themselves in their homes, around their families. And for some students, school is the only place where these students can express their true identity, their true gender identity. And without a policy, they're not going to feel comfortable doing that. They're not going to feel safe. They're not going to feel welcome. And so we think it's important that students do feel safe, do feel welcome, and know what the policies are, so that if their parents are not going to come forward and seek a school's assistance in helping to resolve these types of issues for the student knows that they're going to be okay. So what are the categories of the policy? Just briefly. Categories are privacy and confidentiality, records keeping, official records versus unofficial records, names and pronouns of how students are addressed, restroom accessibility, locker room accessibility, sports, athletics, and physical education, school activities and programs, course accessibility, dress codes, student safety, education, and training. And I just read from the subject headings of the Lower Merion School District administrative regulations on gender expansive and transgender students. And it's our Citizens Council recommendation that this committee consider adopting both this policy and the regulation. There's a very brief policy. The regulation is 10 pages. And consider that we're also going to provide the Pennsbury School District policy. You'll see the Pennsbury policy is a lot lighter than the Lower Merion School District policy, because they just chose to leave out certain aspects of considerations of these issues. But we want you to see what a neighboring school district has just enacted in November of 2016. And it's also important to know that New Hope Salisbury is very close to finalizing and adopting transgender policy. And what was the other? And Central Bucks is also close to adopting their policy. We don't think Council Rock, being one of the finest school districts in this Commonwealth, should be the last of its neighbors to enact a policy. And one issue that comes up repeatedly in terms of the flip side, the flip side being, I'm a parent who's concerned about my student, my child being in a locker room or a bathroom with someone who's transgender or gender expansive, and my child tells me they're uncomfortable with that. Every policy provides that any student that is uncomfortable, any student, should be provided with a facility that would allow that student to use, for example, a single stall bathroom, or have a private changing area if the student is uncomfortable being in a locker room. And so there really, if the policy is well crafted, and we would suggest that the Lower Merion School District policy is very well considered and written, and even the Pennsbury School District policy is well written. But what's important is protecting the students who are at risk and allowing students who are uncomfortable with those other students for any reason to have their own private space, to go to the bathroom or use the locker room. And if that's happening, we just think that it's so much better. And again, this, people focus on the bathrooms and the locker rooms. That's what you hear a lot of stories about in the news, but there's so much more to it, including all the other subject areas that I talked about. And in terms of protecting those students, we'd like to see the committee take action and the board take action and do it before the end of the school year. Because again, the risk is real. And I brought 4 copies of each of these policies. I'd like to give the superintendent.
Actually, you only, what?
Electronic?
You actually only have to give 1 copy to
We'll scan
the
it.
superintendent. He'll scan it and distribute it to all board members.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then obviously your comments are available for board members on the
I'm sure they're
replay.
also available on the websites of the school districts.
Yeah, but
Absolutely.
he did the work for us, so.
Right.
And I also have PDFs, so I can just email.
Oh, that would be even easier. Just
I
do
can email
that.
them to you. That'd be fantastic. I can do it right now.
Perfect. Thank you.
You know,
You send it to board members at CRSD.org.
Save everybody time,
we'll
yeah.
all get it, yeah.
We'll all get it.
And just to add an additional piece to that too, is just keep in mind for your consideration that, and it's the same for all the diverse categories, right, is that many times we think of these things as, well, it's affecting such a small population that we don't need this, or we can handle it on a case-by-case basis, but we've realized that handling things on a case-by-case basis or not taking care of a small population is how we ended up into where we are today, where things become major issues and get brought to public attention. So just thought to consider.
It's an important, you raise a point which is lost on some, so I speak of it not to you, but just for general population. You spoke of it, and not to the content, but actually the structure of what you talked about. First, thank you for bringing it forward, and we'll review it and consider it. There's an important differentiation between board policy and administrative regs. It bears discussion for a moment. The board policy is the policy set by the board that is an imposition imposed upon staff, public, everybody. The administrative regulations are actually, in industry, we have SOPs, and then we have the work instructions. And the work instructions are how you execute to make the SOPs happen. The SOPs are typically, in that instance, a statement of direction, of philosophy, of ethos, and how you want to move forward. And the work instructions is the actual, what happens at the rock face. We have the same thing. And the administrative regulations are typically the domain of the superintendent and the administrative staff within the school. They define oftentimes so much greater detail than the board, because if we define it in board SOP, whatever we call it, policy, it becomes static. And it gets onto a cycle, and you're looking at us going through documents today. Some of these documents are 8 years old and older. So as we look at what you provide us, and thank you again for doing it, we'll work with Robert to see what is the best, Robert Fraser, the superintendent, to see what is the best locale around these. And I think that we'll take into consideration the point you make that one school district gave the very short one, which probably is more in line with what I'm describing when I say the intent and the ethos of the board, and then look to the corresponding administrative reg. So we certainly will bring it up, and probably at the discussion when we come back to our items we talked about so long today, we'll cover it then and talk about it then, and we'll publicly advertise meeting. We'll make sure you're aware. But thank you again, and lest we be remiss for your participation interactively in the meeting. It does make the meetings longer, but they are important topics, so we do appreciate it.
No, it makes the output better.
If that's good, then we can cover the 2 and we'll be out of here. I don't anticipate a great deal of discussion on 123.1, 123.2. Want to try and make a pass of them tonight, guys?
When would the next committee meeting be where you would take these matters up again?
The policy meetings are the 4th Thursday of the month generally. They're the Thursday after the board meeting. Board meetings are generally the 3rd Thursday.
It would be the 27th, I believe.
Yes, I believe so.
7 p.m.
Let's see if we can do special ed as a separate. Okay, well, you have something else you do, like work? I'm kidding. Well,
We already have-
let's put special ed, let's put special ed purpose-built on May, for the May meeting. Yeah, we will designate, Josh, you good with that? Is that okay with you? Purpose-built, the May meeting is special ed policies.
And should we,
What?
I aim to serve.
and when should we expect the response on the review of the transgender policy?
We'll talk about that at our next meeting. This is the meeting in April.
April 27th.
April 27th, it'll be the topic. It'll be one of the topics of discussion at that.
If we can, if it's possible, since most of this is probably going to be ed reg, if you guys could have a perspective coming into that meeting, what you would suggest, we would probably get through it faster rather than have to.
Okay.
Right,
Trudge through it. So if there's something to work from.
Let's look at the documents.
Yeah.
We'll ask, we'll solicit, I'll solicit the input back to me individually as chair to work with Robert.
Yep.
To try and put something together between now and then. And then, as is our practice, what we propose will be published at least a week before the meeting. And it'll be on the web, right? We do it a week before?
Yep.
And so whatever we come up with will be on the web the week before.
Or we could come up with something as a framework and kick it back to Robert.
No, that's what he means. So we're going to see what they kick to us. And then we'll coordinate our feedback on what we see to Jerry. And then Jerry and Robert will
Okay.
consolidate.
I just want to make sure we're not having Robert start at ground
If
zero.
any sub-forum of this group would like to work with me on it, I know Ed likes to craft some words, and you like to
Rick
craft
just
some words.
texted me, so he's.
Rick's available
For a face.
All right, I'll put aside 6 hours to do this. All right, let's look quickly at 120, I lost my, 123.1, which is concussion management. Chuck, this was in your space today.
And I did review them and I went over them with Rudy as well. These are relatively new policies, I think 2012. So I don't think there's a lot of change. The only suggestions I had, both policies in athletic activity. Number 3, non-competitive cheerleading. And then above that, it says including cheerleading. So unless there's a distinction I'm not catching, I don't know why those are both listed.
Which one are you on? 120?
Concussion management, which is 123.1,
Yeah.
but cardiac, sudden cardiac arrest, 123.2, does the same thing.
Oh,
So
I
under athletic activity, number 2, it's talking about athletic, including cheerleading, and then number 3 says non-competitive
see.
cheerleading.
Yeah, just cheerleading.
I don't know why you need both.
So I had a question it's my understanding that we have our athletic trainers do our testing and evaluation, and they release the kids back to sports. They come with doctor notes too, but I read this like we're having a psychiatrist, a neurologist, or this looks like we're doing something with medical. Am I reading this incorrectly? With a licensed physician who's trained in the evaluation management of concussion?
That's defined, where you're defining an appropriate medical professional. So if you're telling me that, and I don't spend as much time as I should, if you're telling me that a child can bring a note that releases them back to play, this would be
So we don't,
where they're coming
it's
from.
from personal experience, although this was done in 12, and my experience ended in sometime, I don't remember, 13. So I might have it wrong, but the athletic trainer does a baseline. The kids go, if they get hurt, they have to come back with a note from a doctor. Then they have to also pass our concussion test again, and then we let them play. So that might be more than we're doing here or less, but I was a little, and Chuck, I don't know that it's your area, but we might want to have the athletic director
Yeah, we might want to
peruse
Rob that.
this.
I will absolutely do that. I didn't know what this process was. I
That's
didn't want to
That's
go,
okay.
I didn't want to send it out to him before hearing what you
We don't,
have to say.
I have to tell you, this is the sloppiest thing I've seen in a long time. Because in the 20.
from PSBA, you mean?
Yeah,
Okay, just to be clear, I got you.
123.1, they make a great deal of giving us the definitions of appropriate medical
Right.
professionals. And I'm looking through the document for where they use that term.
On
Return to
guidelines,
play.
on guidelines.
No, because on guidelines, they get to the appropriate school officials, physicians, neuropsychologists, athletic trainers, and then they go through and they define it. It was like, So what was the point of the term? You know,
It looks like it's a regurgitation of Act 101 of 2011.
well, if it,
If you click on that one, like, it's just regurgitating that language.
yes, my point is always, then are we if this is law, so Chuck, this is one thing that comes out of these meetings frequently, and you were here for that part of it, I think, before. If it's law and we don't have to have it, then the law is good, and we'll pare this down to law.
Well, that'll take out almost all the ones in special education then. Because they're pretty much regurgitation.
Pretty much, unless the law says, and sometimes it does, you have to have a policy that mirrors this law, then we have to have it. But if none of that
I thought
is,
we also had some discussion about the fact that there's some value to the public for us having this as part of our policy rather than requiring the public to go look up state law. I mean.
but there's a medium ground somewhere we have to find.
Yes.
a middle ground.
May I ask a dumb question? Why do we single out cheerleading? What? Why do we single out cheerleading? Is cheerleading a sport or is it not a sport? Is it
Well, you know
all under the
what,
umbrella?
honestly, cheerleading is called out because it was always viewed not to be a sport.
Right.
And then when you have predominantly women being thrown high into the air and
I'm
the
not
catch miss,
suggesting it shouldn't be in there.
There's-
I'm
You
saying,
would have just assumed it was a sport, and why are we calling it out?
why?
because historically it wasn't called out.
Right, but I mean, it almost seems discriminatory, like, and the fake athletes,
And the what?
and the fake athletes, we'll let them in too. I don't think that we should have a,
When I was in high school cheerleading, the cheerleaders stayed on the ground and they could only get as high as a leg.
I'm suggesting they're covered under
You're
club-sponsored
150 years
sports
old.
and activities, period. I don't know why we're following with the historical.
Let's give
Where is
Chuck
the
time
reference?
to have the athletic.
Where is the reference?
And, so we were leaders in concussions, this district was. We, and Scott at South, State Jetter,
And
he
Mike.
was, I mean, this was a long time ago, but he actually piloted the program with St. Mary's, and it was, they tested it, it was so successful. It spread into all the other, it's now like the standard, what high schools do. So, I'm sure reading policy is on the top of his list, and maybe, I think we do. My concern would be that if I was a parent and I read this and I came to you with some doctor's note, and then you couldn't pass the concussion test and we didn't let you play, you could come back to us and say, oh no, your policy says Joe Schmo doctor signed off and my kid can go get hit in the head again. So the concern probably is that concussion testing changes and it's evolved over time. You have concussion center now, having been driven. So like, I know there's gonna be some desire to allow flexibility, and I'm okay with that. I would just feel better if we had the people, and in particular, you know, at the athletic trainer at Nick, he may know as much too, I don't disparage him. I just happen to know, the people at South know quite a bit about this.
I have to ask a question. I think there's an error in this. In 123.1, athletic activity shall mean all of the following. When you come into 2, it says, an athletic contest or competition other than interscholastic athletics. And I honestly think, I'm trying to read that and thinking, is that meant to be other than intra?
No, I think it's saying that
athletics?
it's number one is saying
Yeah, it's
interscholastic.
saying
Number one's
Number one's inner
inner.
and.
No.
Includes everything else,
Well, here's my question.
except non-competitive cheerleading.
Well, but okay, wait, so help me understand this. Show me where this does not apply, because I don't think this applies, to the 2 teams from the same school playing volleyball against each other. It's an intra-scholastic, INTRA scholastic. This policy does not, it's not a coached activity, that's my point is, athletic activity shall mean all of the following, an athletic competition
Okay.
or contest or competition other than intra. That's my point. It should be, that one should be intra-scholastic, because this is not meant to
It
apply.
falls in any sports activity sponsored by district affiliated organization.
Why don't we let them take
But
it
this
back and
is-
look at it and just.
Yeah.
But no, but this is inclusive of, this is,
What do you think?
we need definition on it. Do you understand how I'm trying to read, how I'm
But
reading it?
if we have 2 high school teams playing against one
No.
another.
I have 2 teams in the same high school. 2 kids, a bunch of kids get together.
You can have in a gym class.
everything's district.
School-sponsored event is
Yeah.
really just, and let it go. School-sponsored event.
This concussion management applies to a school sponsored event?
Well, it should be titled concussion management and athletics, because we do a whole lot of concussion management that has nothing to do with athletics in schools.
But if I have,
Yes. Oh, so
We like to drop
that's
off, so
covered
all
somewhere
schools
else.
like that.
Seventh
No,
graders
it's not
coming
covered.
into
What
gym
I'm saying,
classes
this is
and
just
getting
talking about-
screened.
Athletics.
I mean, it's.
Although the title
it's
is-
down the steps.
I think
Yes,
Chuck
you're
just
right.
made an
You're right.
important point, and Alex made a point, which is, this is about concussion management and athletics, because it references the baselines that we do for
Right.
athletes. So it doesn't apply to non-athletes.
Because we haven't done a
Because
baseline.
the baseline is
Right, we don't
not,
have the information.
what's your definition of athlete?
So athletics.
I think the athletic department should work on this policy.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay, but my understanding is it is not intended to, my understanding was, it was not intended to be used for intra-scholastic, which is, I'll say it's uncoached.
Yeah, no,
It's-
they don't have a baseline.
Right, because they don't have-
Only on the team.
But it doesn't say that anywhere here.
Yeah,
That's
so they'll take it back if they're gonna look at it.
Okay, good. So this will come back,
What about 23?
About the same thing, wasn't
Same
it?
thing.
it's the same, it's got the same defense. So when's it coming back? We want to have this one back. This would be in June. This will come back in June, because, yeah, because we're gonna finish up the discrimination things. If it's available to come back I'm sorry, April's gonna be the discrimination and diversity.
Right.
If this fits into that, that's fine, if it's available. Then May is special education, and June is catch up, and this if it hasn't been covered yet.
And moving on to the next.
Yeah,
Whatever
that's true.
the next sequence is. I anticipate special ed will take a while, but we'll see. We'll get up there.
That one,
Does that work for everyone? Public comment, we've already done. Board comment? All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.